Fine. Okay, so I would like to start by thanking David for this generous invitation, and this is my second invitation already to Colegio de Mexico. And with this, of course, with the invitation came also a difficult part, which is a long journey, 12-hour journey between Paris and Mexico City. And luckily or unluckily, I don't know, this gave me ample time to reread and rethink my paper and to be really unhappy about certain of my arguments. And what I basically realized is that my paper was, and I was under the impression that you would have all read it by now, but okay, good that you didn't. I think my paper was very telegraphic, and so I decided that maybe before, it's very telegraphic, although it is a part of a very ambitious, unrealistically ambitious project of writing cultural history of Jesuit and Mughal encounters from Persian texts. Well, I realized that some concepts that I'm going to talk about here in a telegraphic style may not be immediately, you may not understand them the way I understand them, because they're a little bit tweaked in the way I want to use them. And so I just wanted to give you some pointers on that. One of them is enchantment. So I will be talking about enchantment, but I use the word in a much larger sense than religious enchantment as religion, but also we can be enchanted by science, by technology, by literature, by history. So my idea of enchantment is much larger. Also, I'm talking about novelty, or new, or strange and amazing. And of course, we can all think about 17th and 18th century discussions, debates between moderns and ancients, and especially in the 18th century, debates on whether novelty is good or bad. But here I am basically using this word novelty to suggest that Jesuit missionaries, that it is a kind of an instrument that the Jesuit missionaries offered to their converts. And that is to say, Jesuits had to, by trial and error, figure out what their converts or future converts or would-be converts like. So, and this is, I guess, this is what to be intellectual, intercultural, intellectual is precisely to figure out what are those best instruments in this kind of cultural encounter. So the enchantment through novelty is typically the space of intercultural translation that I want to study, and that this paper is basically about. And second, just before I start, I want to apologize to Joan Pau Rubies for not trusting him on his early insights of the utility of Wittgenstein's language games in his first and important book. I probably didn't understand what you were talking about then, and these days I am very much beginning to understand what you meant, especially after having read more and more in the context of studying accommodation, having read Catholic theologians who debate about equivocation and mental reservation, such as Domingo de Soto and Martin de Azpilcueta. So my paper is not exactly on that, but it is not far from these problems and topics. So in this paper, I want to propose a hypothesis that, contrary to a usual view in scholarly literature, the method of accommodation was not simply based on an effort at presenting Christianity as something similar or better than what existed already in local religious traditions, but that the major charm of Christianity, in India at least, the field that I know, was that it brought something new and foreign, and which stimulated what I call re-enchantment. However, each political and social context was different, and the type and the dosage of foreignness that may have worked in one place may fail in another. So the structure of this strategy of what I call deep conversion is epitomized in the Ignatian formula entrar con el otro y salir consigo. There are different versions on the same topic. And this is the basis of a threefold scheme. The convert is lured through a likeness, which is then rejected as lacking, and then replaced by new, unfamiliar, strange, but also finally tamed. So I will, it's not very visible what there is, but I will now briefly look into two texts and will focus more closely on how they presented the life of Christ, life of Jesus, in their rendition of Christianity. One is the Tamil language Flos Sanctorum by Enrique Enriquez, published in 1586 on the Pearl Fishery Coast Mission in South India, and destined as a pastoral book on and Christian calendar for the Parava Catholics, a particular caste of pearl fishing people on the coast. And the other one is the life of Jesus, entitled Mirat al-Quds, or the Mirror of Holiness, written in Persian around 1602 for the Mughal Emperor Akbar by Jerome Xavier, with the help of Abd al-Sattar bin Qasim Lahori. And Xavier's Persian, Abd al-Sattar was Xavier's Persian specialist and intermediary, and himself a quite learned man. For this presentation, I worked on printed versions of these texts. Life of Jesus is, of course, only one among many stories in Flos Sanctorum, and I will zoom more closely on one or two episodes that the two books have in common, but choose to tell in a very different way. So both books are translations of and compilations from other books. Enriquez lists exactly his sources, 3 or more or less contemporary books, and their authors in his prologue. And while Jerome Xavier names no names, but hints at our books, he says, or ancient books, and it's obviously presumed that Akbar may know them in different versions. Now, both audiences, Catholic Paravas and Akbar at the Mughal court, the emperor of the Mughal court, were already familiar with most of the stories and events told in these books. And yet, the two books differ in important ways, and for one of them, the Mirat al-Quds, we have a hostile commentary on the Jesuit enterprise written some years later by precisely Abd al-Sattar bin Qasim Lahori, Xavier intermediary, and his comment on the Jesuit literature in Persian opens the window to a new balanced view of Mughal reception of the Jesuit catechetical efforts than the Jesuit hagiographies normally provide. Basically, he bashed the Jesuits and their knowledge of Persian. Unfortunately, no such hostile, because they're really useful, comments is extant on Flos Sanctorum by Enriquez. Now, while Mirat al-Quds was written as a bait to enchant and to hook the Mughal emperor, actually those words are used, hook, into espousing Christianity, so what may be called, I call it a hook book, Flos Sanctorum was already a pastoral piece geared at standardizing the repertoire of saints, their deeds, prayers to be addressed, and the daily use in churches and pious houses of the Catholic communities. Now, both texts manipulated and tweaked Tamil and Persian vocabulary as best as they could to accommodate Christian.
You need to speak closer to the microphone.
Sorry. Oh, you don't understand? Ah, sorry, I didn't. I heard myself. That is enough. Okay, should I start all over again? Okay. Now, both texts, therefore, manipulated and tweaked Tamil and Persian vocabulary to accommodate Christian meaning. And I have shown elsewhere how effective language of the sin and repentance was developed in Tamil Christian expressions in Enrique Enriquez's another of his work, Confessionario. And it has been already noted by other scholars that Xavier used Islamic and Sufi metaphors and stuffed his text with Arabic Quranic formulas and concepts, as was the case, typical case it was the case with literary productions at the Mughal court. However, while Flos Sanctorum follows as much as possible Catholic catechetical literature and is based on clearly mentioned European sources, Mirat al-Quds is more complicated since it does not correspond to Latin Vulgate Bible nor to other books from the prophets that Xavier, without specifying mentions as his sources. In general, it's clear that Xavier incorporated all kinds of apocryphal texts. In fact, when a Protestant Orientalist, Ludovico de Dieu, translated Mirat al-Quds into Latin and published it in 1639 in Amsterdam, he pointed, with scorn and disgust, to its texture that contains stories and descriptions that are not from the New Testament, and his term for this book is, as you can see here, Historia Contaminata. It is well known that the Malabar and Chinese rites controversies were triggered by the dispute over Jesuit translation of the key Christian concepts. For example, Enriquez's decision not to translate the concept such as baptism, but to transcribe it phonetically into Tamil as vavutissimo, triggered the controversy when Roberto Nobili, who used Jnana Snanam, when Nobili used Jnana Snanam, it triggered the conflict. Because Jnana Snanam is a Sanskrit descriptive term meaning spiritual bath, which in the end finally prevailed in Tamil and Konkani. Now, Xavier, on the other hand, chose an Arabic term, amada, in Persian. However, he uses hoda, an old Persian word for God, a Zoroastrian term, while he uses Allah in only descriptive formulas such as the shadow of God, Zelallah, which is an attribute of the king, and the spirit of God, Ruh Allah, for Jesus or the Holy Spirit. Now, these choices on an atomic level of meaning are important because they are signposts of the overall tone and intention. But there are also interesting accommodationist choices on the macro level of the narrative story and plotline. First of all, while Enriquez avoided emphasizing his authorship of the published catechetical books, he never said, I wrote it with somebody, or it was written. Xavier, on the other hand, inscribes himself as an author in the beginning and the end of the manuscript. He signs it in the beginning and in the end. Moreover, he also turns himself into an actor in the story itself. So Xavier inaugurated his book with an apocryphal story of Abgarus, the first king who reportedly converted to Christianity during Jesus' life, and whose name in Persian is a near anagram of Akbar. Akbar, I didn't do that. Yes. And so this king is also famous. I mean, these pictures are, I'll get there. This king is also famous for receiving a letter from Christ and the Holy Mandilion, painted without hands, by way of a painter whom the king sent to meet Christ in person. So here is the damaged picture you can see on your left, the damaged picture of one of the illustrated manuscripts of Mirat al-Quds from Lahore. And I just added one Mandilion from somewhere from the internet of how it can be represented. It can be represented in many different ways. This is just one of them, happened to be Czech. Now, Xavier told in detail the story of how the painter struggled to produce a portrait of Christ, and after various unsuccessful versions, had been finally saved by Christ's gift of the cloth with the face imprinted on it. We know the story, but just a few lines after this story, Xavier told another story, this time of his own writing pains in composing Mirat al-Quds. I quote, I arranged it several times and considered it finished, but every time I completed it and made a clean copy of the draft, when I compared the Persian to books in Latin, my heart sank, and what had been perfect appeared so defective that I was ashamed of my labor. Finally, the divine grace as well helped him in translating the book from Latin to Persian that he then presented to His Majesty, Hazrat Akbar, with his framing device, Actually, Xavier is basically telling Akbar that his book is also holy, unwritten, holy, and made without hands, and a miraculous product as worthy as Quran. Now, the book was miraculously created or translated, and the stories it contained, that Xavier was trying to persuade Akbar, they were also, his book was miraculously created, but also where the miracles of Christ were also, well, miraculous. And he was therefore inviting Akbar to participate in this kind of enchanted and enchanting world, mutually enchanting world. However, having thus established the miraculous quality of his book, Xavier went on to introduce the characters in the story and never failed to exhort his audience, principally Akbar, to feel astonished, he would say. This is very curious, this is very incredible, this is very, he's actually using these words in the text for this event or for that event or for any action. Indeed, the performative aspect of the text with interspersed dialogues between actors does not only point to its theatrical qualities, which have already been detected by Galvin Bailey, but it is also a road narrative, since the principal actors are constantly on the move, and geographic and ethnographic details of Jesus' life are taken care of in minute detail. So there is a pictorial feel to many of the scenes and sceneries in Mirat al-Quds, such as physical descriptions of Mary with her golden hair and her eyes tending to dark blue, and Jesus with his wine-colored hair and beard, as if Xavier knew and banked on the fact that his text would be illustrated in the imperial workshop, as they in fact were. These are two pictures from the Cleveland manuscript. But the most important feature of the narrative is that each statement of vivid and palpable description, or following a particular action which was obviously part of Christian past, leads to prospective Mughal future. That is the moment of conversion. In this episode, episode I want to talk about, episode of circumcision, which is extremely short in Mirat al-Quds and which remains unillustrated, compared to Enriquez' Flos Sanctorum, who has a very long passage taken partly from Jacques de Voragine, La Légende dorée, and Fray Diogo de Rosario Flos Sanctorum. Now, Christian future is folded, so to speak, on top of Jewish past, which is also Muslim present. Now, this right is explained as belonging to the old God's command given to the children of Israel, and which the presence of Christ rendered obsolete. In Xavier's words, although it was God's will that Christ, quotation, although it was God's will that Christ abolish circumcision, he still willed that Christ be circumcised to show the rightness of the ancient custom. And in order not to be treated as foreigner or someone without religion, continued Xavier, Jesus would, another quote, would show himself like the others in order to win the hearts of the children of Israel. Now, with this elliptic presentation, Xavier evokes Jewish past, which could be easily identified as Muslim present, and announces its future in Christian religion, in which circumcision would not be necessary. However, in no way did Xavier denigrate the rite, which in Persian retained its Arabic form, khatana, and had, of course, a whole set of important meanings in Islamic religious texts and practice. Christian theology is used here to enchant human chronology by mixing it with eschatological time. Henriquez, on the other hand, following although never to the letter, Diogo de Rosario's long entry on circumcision and the naming of Jesus, to which Xavier afforded a single phrase, transforms Christ's circumcision into a highly charged moment of bodily and emotional suffering. On this feast day of January 1st, the Parava could read that When our Lord Jesus was circumcised, he got much pain. He shed his blood for us. He suffered pain and wept because of the pain. Now, the motive of Jesus' blood, pain and suffering, is repeatedly evoked in the context of human sins, and it runs from the circumcision, in Tamil it's sunat, from Arabic term for simply religious rite, to the suffering on the cross. Now, although Enriquez was also tweaking and converting Judeo-Christian history to fit into Tamil affective and religious sensibilities, the Tamil Bhakti sensibility, his Flo Sanctorum, and even more his Confessionario were geared, as I showed elsewhere, to teach psychological self-discipline and social and cultural management of the self, to which new and fledgling Catholic of this new and fledgling Catholic community of the Pauravas. Now, the strangers, the Judeo-Christian saints, apostles, and martyrs who came as integral part of Christian enchantment machine were already at this point in 1580, when Confessionario was published, for more than half a century, companions and protectors of the Catholic Paurava community. However, even in Confessionario, embedded in the chapter on circumcision, Enriquez felt compelled to admonish Paurava to stop calling their children by their Tamil names and use rather their Christian names. And so he says, if anybody calls you by the Tamil name, you don't reply. Now, Flo Sanctorum, a pastoral text par excellence, was obviously anchored in present and acting on the present. Mirat al-Quds, which is not a pastoral text, but as I called it, a text hook, proposed a window into the past, Jewish and in a way Muslim past, in order to plot an enchanting Christian future, but it failed to persuade, but may have succeeded as an album of Mughal paintings. I cannot go into pictorial aspect here because it was not in the hands of the Jesuits. They had nothing to do with it. So the story was, okay, I actually have some, no? As you can see, I put just some of the paintings. The story was, as can be seen, enticing for Mughal painters and their patrons, Akbar and Jahangir, but as I said, it is not in Jesuit hands. Now, the reasons for the failure of the text can be read in Abd al-Sattar's Majalisi Jahangiri. His text, written a couple of years, in 1607, I think, or 12, I'm not so sure anymore. Majalisi Jahangiri, which basically means Jahangir's assembly, Jahangir's divan assembly, while from his other works, because he has written a couple of more interesting things about Europe and Europeans, Tamarat al-Falasifa and Ahwali Firangistan, it is clear that the enchantment with Xavier and his text was in his presentation of foreign European knowledge, history and geography in particular, and not of religion and the story of Jesus, who was one of the prophets according to Quran, so everybody knew about him. He was actually also respected. In the Majalisi Jahangiri, so the assembly of Jahangir, Abd al-Sattar reports on various discussions among the Mughal elite and before Jahangir on life of Jesus and the Injil, or the Gospel, which they refused as ultimately as corrupt book of stories and not a divine book. Now, this was a standard Muslim refutation of both Jewish and Christian holy books. With all his enchanting machine of persuasion, Xavier basically achieved nothing. In fact, Xavier was one of many strangers who enchanted to a point only, and entertained the cosmopolitan Mughal court. Among the Zoroastrian, Jain, Brahmin, and various Muslim scholars, the Jesuits did not do well in public discussion, according to Abd al-Sattar, mostly because of their poor knowledge of Persian, he says, and in addition to easily get angry, they would get angry, and they sweated profusely. Now, the reason Xavier left the Mughal court in 1605 was because, as he put it, the fish did not bite, and we can add the hook, or did not bite the hook. On the other hand, the pearl fishing community not only got hooked, they made Christianity into the stuff that helped them recreate their identity in the way they actually wanted it. The play of familiar and strange had to be balanced in Jesuit presentation differently for different audiences and in different political contexts. The Mughal mission was probably the toughest Jesuit mission because Muslims already knew too much about Christianity and its past. And the Mughal emperor had no use of it except as a window into the wider world, an enchanted world of European science, art, and history, the world of future. Now, the Jesuits failed at the Mughal court in another sense. They failed to produce, what you can say, the intercultural intellectuals. They did not manage, they did manage that in other missions, the most importantly in Goa, but not at the Mughal court. That is to say, converted communities who became completely Christianized. In fact, locally grown intercultural intellectuals were themselves the most efficient common ground on which the deep conversion could take roots and establish Catholic sociability and community. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And so we'll open it up for 5 minutes of questions. And as I said, then at the end of the session, we can have even more questions. Yes?
Of the boat as being the snake Ananta and Christ having the figure of Vishnu, no? It's that the miniature is just there, no? So I'm putting that up front because of the question of Hinduism that was also important, I guess, in this assimilation, no?
It's very difficult to hear.
So, well, it was just an observation, no? What do you think about this assimilation of Islam and Hinduism, and what do you think about her interpretation?
Well, you know, I'm not yet there, so to speak, in terms of my research. These are the early days of this is the third mission, Mughal mission, but they are still not sure how they are going to succeed. Things are going on, but they are not, I'm not so sure that this is from that period. When is she, what is her?
Well, it's Masih Nama, yeah, it's a little bit later, but you have it there.
Yeah, no, the Dastani Masih.
Yeah, the life of Christ.
Yeah. But,
it's a Mughal miniature. I think it's at the time of Akbar.
If you come from the art history point of view, I'm not so well. I must say I don't know enough about the pictorial. So there things might have gone, but in any case, what was clear is that the Mughal art the Mughal art ateliers were picking up things from everywhere, and they are interpreting whatever there was, whether they were symbols or iconography from Christian or Hindu or whatever. They were interpreting it and putting it maybe not in the center of the paint of the miniature, but definitely on the margins, especially on the rims, where all kinds of stuff appear. For example, Christ and the cross appear on the margins of or how do you call it, the frames of the Mughal paintings, which looks bizarre, but from our point of view, but didn't look bizarre from their point of view. They were basically, this is what I'm talking about, enchantment. Anything was good to enchant. So this kind of visual enchantment, I still don't know enough. I'm still working through the textual enchantment, and believe me, it's not easy at all. But this visual enchantment, actually, Eba Koch has written about, Sumati Ramaswamy has written about, Sanjay Subramaniam has written about. I mean, everybody who hasn't written about recently. It's one of the probably the most flourishing fields is precisely this. But I think that nobody really read Jesuit texts properly. This is why I think somebody should, because especially if you look at the latest, this is the article by Muzaffar Alam and Sanjay Subramaniam, they basically have a very negative idea of Jesuits didn't know anything. For example, Xavier says, I learned Persian in 6 months, which looks a bit fishy. But then if you read Majalisi Jahangiri, you see that Abdus Sattar says, I learned Latin in 6 months. So 6 months, and then I'm translating this with somebody who is Iranian expert on medical text, never mind medieval medical text. But he says this is 6 months is a kind of a topos of you learn something. If you want to say that you've learned something good, you've learned it for 6 months. So obviously this is a topos, 6 months, and nobody has probably learned anything in 6 months. But this is the way to say that you have. So. Yeah, I don't know why.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Let's go on. Oh, go on. Is there another? What? Yeah, we'll do more questions later.
Okay.
Yes, okay. Well, it's my honor to introduce our colleague David Lorenzen, who many of you know very well. David has worked here at CEA in El Colegio de Mexico since 1970. He's done research on popular religious movements in India, particularly that of the followers of a 15th century poet named Kabir. Since about the year 2000, he has also worked on the 18th century history of a Roman Catholic mission in North India, the so-called Tibet or Tibet Hindustan Mission. He has a forthcoming online publication that is a study, translation, and edition of a fictional Christian-Hindu dialogue written by one of the missionaries of this mission. David.
Thank you. Just a second. I didn't do a PowerPoint, but I have a couple illustrations I want to put on. Okay. Oops, no, this is okay. The book I'm going to talk about is a Hindu-Christian dialogue written in 1751 by a Capuchin missionary named Giuseppe Maria da Gargiano e... Bueno, this is a picture of him, but it doesn't seem to come out full. How can I make it big? Oh, okay, here. Okay, you can... This is the frontispiece of a biography of him written by one of his friends and companions called Cassiano da Macerata. He's baptizing one of the heathens. There's a list of kind of a line of them behind. And in the background are all the books that he supposedly translated from Sanskrit to Italian. Unfortunately, none of these things exist. The one book that does exist is the one I'm going to talk about today. And this is a copy of the first page of the book. It's a book written in Hindustani language, and it's called A Dialogue Between a Christian and a Hindu About Religion. There's 2 manuscripts of this book. The other one was copied in 1787. It's a little bit different, includes a word-by-word translation into Italian, as well as a more more full translation into Italian of the same text. Okay, as John mentioned, I've prepared a translation, edition, and study of this dialogue, which is being published by the Colegio. Unfortunately, it's not quite out, but it will be published online for free, so anyone can consult it. Okay, the Capuchin author of the dialogue was stationed mostly in the small kingdom of Betia in northwestern Bihar, not far from the Nepal border. He was born in 1709 into an aristocratic family of north-central India as Bernardino Bernini. After becoming a Capuchin friar, he took the name Giuseppe Maria da Gargiano. He died in Betia city in 1761. We know a fair amount about Giuseppe Maria's life thanks to a biography written by his friend and fellow Capuchin friar Cristiano da Macerata, which was published in India in 1767. The details of that this biography gives about the daily life in this small provincial kingdom and the difficulties faced by the missionaries there make it a valuable and rather unique historical source. Here, however, I will have to skip over this topic. The dialogue between a Christian and a Hindu about religion, written in 1751 by Giuseppe Maria with the help from his Capuchin friend and biographer, the same Cristiano da Macerata, and from an unnamed Brahmin teacher. This teacher apparently taught Giuseppe Maria to read Hindustani and some Sanskrit, instructed him in the basics of Hindu religion, and corrected the Hindustani text of the dialogue. A copy of the Hindustani text was first presented to the Raja of Betia in October or November 1751. Subsequently, an undetermined number of manuscript copies were distributed among persons in the Betia area. One manuscript of the Hindustani text, dated 751, as the first illustration I put on, was sent to Rome and is now in the Vatican Library. This manuscript also includes an Italian version of the text. In other words, the text was used both to offer arguments for Christianity to Indians and to transmit information about Hindu religion to Rome. Another bilingual manuscript of the text, the other one we saw, dated 1787, is also found in the same library. In 1907, a much revised and expanded Hindi edition was published in the city of Betia. It is written in a much more standardized and Sanskritized language, roughly equivalent to modern standard Hindi. Giuseppe Maria da Gargiano is said to have read and in some cases translated a considerable number of Hindu texts written in Sanskrit and Hindi. Some of these sources are mentioned in the dialogue. They include the following: the Lanka Kanda of a Ramayan, probably the important text written by Tulsidas, the Ramayan in general, the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata in general, the Bhagavata Purana, the Brahma Purana, the Linga Purana, the Bhugola Purana, which is some text about geography, the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda, the 4 famous Vedas. Here I want to make a few comments about only the 4 Vedas. The question of Giuseppe Maria's possible knowledge of the four Vedas is a puzzling one. Cassiano da Macerata notes that Giuseppe Maria always had an, quote, an ardent desire to learn in depth the false dogmas of the Brahmins in order to fundamentally combat them, end of quote. And for this reason decided that he should translate some of these texts, quote, under the direction of the language teacher, end quote, that he had employed. Among these texts were the four Vedas, but Cassiano notes that in this case there were special problems. This is quoting Cassiano. His principal idea was to translate the four principal codices that are called Bade, namely mystery. There's an interesting explanation of why they make that translation, but we'll skip that. But since these are held in custody by the Brahmins with extreme jealousy, so that even among the Brahmins only some belonging to specific and distinct tribes are allowed to read them, and since it is not permitted that others learn the Sanskrit language in which the books are written, he saw that he could not achieve his goal. According to Cassiano, then, Giuseppe Maria never managed to read any of the Vedas. Giuseppe's successor in Betia, Marco della Tomba, goes so far as to suggest that the four Vedas probably never existed, quote, at least as real books. Nonetheless, in the dialogue, Giuseppe Maria claims to have read the Vedas and cites some arguments that he says are taken from the Samaveda. And the Yajurveda. Here, Giuseppe Maria's Christian claims that these Vedas are strictly monotheistic texts. This is quoting from the dialogue. In the Samaveda and in the Yajurveda, it is written that there is no supreme God apart from the one supreme God, and that one should not worship any deity apart from worship of the supreme light. Moreover, in them it is written that there is no merit from worshipping Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahadeva. To the contrary, there is sin. For this reason, one should not take the name of any deity nor worship him. This is what your Samaveda and Yajurveda declare, end of quote. It is, however, simply not true that the arguments he described are typical of the ideas found in the Vedas, which are, for the most part, resolutely polytheistic, and nowhere mention the supreme Brahman nor the supreme light. Nonetheless, there's a quite complex history of similar claims about the monotheism of the four Vedas by early European missionaries, particularly Jesuits who worked in India and wrote about Hindu religion. As far as I've been able to determine, and I'm willing to be corrected on this point, none of these missionaries had any in-depth direct knowledge of the four Vedas, but some of them seem to have had limited information about these texts from native scholars and converts. The question of when exactly Western missionaries and scholars first obtained access to the four Vedas has no simple answer. The early Jesuit missionary Roberto Nobili, 1577-1656, who worked in South India, makes somewhat confused references to various standard law books, including the books I'm not good on Tamil pronunciation, but anyway, Ejiru, Rug, Sama, Atharva Veda, and Sukla Jesu. In other words, the Yajur, Rig, Saman, Atharva Veda, and Shukla Yajur Veda. Although nobody is said to have secretly received copies of the Vedas from a Sanskrit teacher, what he says about these texts strongly suggests, to me at least, that he had no real knowledge or understanding of their contents. Several missionaries who were in India after Nobili and before Giuseppe Maria also claimed to have had some sort of access to the Vedas. They, like Giuseppe Maria, usually claimed that the chief doctrine taught by the Vedas was monotheism. From where do these early European claims about the monotheism of the four Vedas come? One strong possibility was that some of their Brahmin informants were scholars who did have some knowledge of the four Vedas and chose to give the missionaries what they wanted to hear by relating information about the few texts that from these Vedas that do in fact support the idea of monotheism, or at least monism, most notably the well-known Rig Veda hymns 10:129, the creation hymn 10:121, the golden embryo hymn 1090, the primal man hymn. It's also possible that these Brahmin scholar informants were basing their monotheistic claims on later monotheistic or monistic texts found in the Brahmanas and Upanishads, since the different Brahmanas and Upanishads are traditionally said to be tied to one or other of the four Vedas. Wherever Giuseppe Maria got his information about the contents of the four Vedas, it is largely incorrect. Not surprisingly, Giuseppe Maria da Gargiano's Christian-Hindu dialogue allows only the Christian to make any solid arguments in favor of his own religion. The Hindu does make certain assertions about his own religious beliefs, often in response to the Christian's prodding, but the logic of these assertions is then immediately attacked by the Christian. For example, the Hindu will say, "Yes, I believe that the paths to salvation preached by all religions lead to salvation." Or, "Yes, I believe that a person's fate is written on his forehead at birth." The Christian will then show or attempt to show that such beliefs are illogical. At no point in the dialogue is the Hindu permitted seriously to question or to argue against the beliefs of the Christian, or to present his own arguments for Hindu religion in a convincing fashion. The principal attacks against Hindu religion that the Christian-Hindu dialogue makes are 8. First, against the idea that the religious paths specified in all or nearly all religions were given to different peoples by God, and that all these paths can lead those who follow them to salvation. In other words, the Hindu idea of multiple paths to God. Second, against the idea of the transmigration of souls. Third, against polytheism and idolatry. Fourth, against the idea that Hindu persons are more numerous than Christians, hence the majority rules in this case. 5, against the immoral conduct of the god Shiva, the avatar Krishna, and other Hindu gods and sages as told in Hindu scripture. 6, against the evident implausibility of the hyperbolic details about the size and numbers of the demons, etc., in the stories about the avatar Rama. 7, against the idea that one's fate is written on one's forehead at birth. And 8, finally, against the Brahmins, in other words, the Hindu priests, for having deceived the ordinary Hindus, especially by withholding from them the true contents of the four Vedas. I do not have enough time here to summarize each of these 8 arguments. 3 of the arguments, those about the relative number of Christians and Hindus, about the size of the demons, and the contents of the four Vedas, are based on real or acclaimed empirical evidence. 3 other arguments, those against multiple religious paths to God, against polytheism and idolatry, and against fate being written by God on one's forehead, are based roughly on the supposed logical contradictions that the Hindus' claims embody. One argument about the immoral behavior of Hindu gods is based on ideas about proper moral conduct, ideas claimed to be universal for gods and men alike. Finally, one argument against the idea of transmigration seems based on philosophical theological claims about the nature of souls, going back to Aristotle and the early church fathers. It's this last argument that I'd like to look at a little closer. Arguments against transmigration of souls had not been an important concern for Catholic teachers in Europe since Roman times. Several early church theologians, however, did discuss Pythagorean ideas about transmigration in some detail. Among Giuseppe Maria's missionary predecessors in Asia, Matteo Ricci in China, also wrote a text that attacks the idea of transmigration. In Giuseppe Maria's dialogue, the Christian contrasts the Hindu idea of transmigration to the Christian idea of eternal life in heaven or hell. This is a quoting again from this text. Moreover, the Hindu religion teaches that after death, the souls of persons take another birth. Some then take birth as persons, some take birth as animals or as plants, each according to what labor he has done. Our Christian religion teaches just the opposite. It speaks in this fashion. The souls of persons after death go directly to the presence of the Supreme God to give an account of what labor they have done, and in that very moment justice is done. If he has accepted the true Supreme God and has labored well, then in exchange for his labor he will get salvation. But if he has sinned and has not served the true Supreme God, then at that very moment he will fall into hell and obtain suffering with the devil, and he will never have hope of getting out of hell. From this you can see how different are my scriptures and yours. If, the Christian argues, I can show you that in other respects my scriptures are more logical and hence truer than yours, then you will have to accept that my religion's view against transmigration are also correct. The Christian in Giuseppe Maria's dialogue makes two principal direct arguments against transmigration of souls, and they are as follows. The first argument against transmigration makes a claim, one ultimately going back to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, that human and animal and plant souls cannot be of the same type, since this would lead to undesirable consequences. In particular, it would make it impossible to live without killing human souls, or at least potentially human souls, since we need to eat vegetable food and burn wood, even if we decide not to eat animals. The Christian's second major argument against transmigration is that the division of society into different social classes is necessary for the welfare of the world. In other words, social equalities are created by God himself, not by good or bad karma. And God has done this for man's benefit. It is only in the afterlife that all humans become equal. Just skip the quote. Through the mouth of the Christian, then, Giuseppe Maria combines an argument against transmigration and another in favor of a highly conservative, hierarchical arrangement of society. This choice is not really surprising given the dominant conservative social and political ideology of counter-Reformation Catholicism, but it was a choice likely also influenced by Giuseppe Maria's own aristocratic family background and the fact that his hope for Christian conversions relied heavily on the cooperation of the king of Betia, who certainly did not want the missionaries to stir up social unrest. It's obvious that Giuseppe Maria had an incomplete understanding of the more complex arguments made by Hindu theologians and metaphysicians. Nonetheless, it is also evident that Giuseppe Maria made a considerable effort to read and understand several important Hindu texts written in Hindi and Sanskrit. Allowance must also be made for the fact that Giuseppe Maria and other early missionary scholars from Europe were largely working in an intellectual environment in which no reliable and systematic body of European language scholarship on Indian culture, history, and society had yet appeared. The work of Orientalist scholars on religion and history did not really reach a critical mass until sometime in the first half of the 19th century, about 75 years after Giuseppe Maria wrote his dialogue. Serious studies of Christian tradition by non-Christian Indian scholars took even longer to develop. From all this, it seems reasonable to conclude that in the historical context in which Giuseppe Maria lived, his Christian Hindu dialogue remains a pioneering linguistic and religious experiment. Thank you.
So once again, we'll have 5 minutes for questions now.
I have a longer response on the question of when the missionaries knew the Vedas, which I agree is a complex question. But I just wanted briefly to ask you, does he say anything about how he obtained the texts he is supposed to have translated, or at least the ones that he read?
There's not, he doesn't talk about it directly, but his successor talks about how he got hold of the same text, and it's a complex question about who actually did the work of translating, whether it was Giuseppe Maria or Marco della Tomba. What happened in the case of at least Marco della Tomba is he was left in the palace with a big box of books owned by the Raja of Betia, and these were the books that he was reading. And I assume they're the same books that Giuseppe Maria was reading. Who actually did the reading, who did the translating is a more complex question. But they were basically books in the possession of the Raja of Betia.
Okay, well, we'll have time for questions again later, so we'll go on to the next speaker. The next speaker is Thomas Haddad from University of Sao Paulo, Sao Paulo. Thomas A.S. Haddad is an assistant professor of history of science at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. His research interests include the places of astronomy in early modern culture, especially among the Jesuits, as well as matters relating to the history of scientific books in the Iberian empires. He has published papers and book chapters on such themes and is currently preparing a monograph on inquisitorial censure and science in Portugal. Oh, thanks, sorry.
Well, good afternoon, and first of all, I'd like to thank warmly our hosts and conveners, David Lorenzen and Jose Antonio Cervera. This is a really great opportunity to share a little bit of my my worries, and above all to learn from all of you. And well, I will not present things in the PowerPoint. I'll read my paper. I have just a couple of previous comments before I start reading. My main interest is in the history of astronomy among the Jesuits in different missionary fields related to the Portuguese Empire in general. And the place from where I speak is the history of science, and I think the history of science has toned up the scientific achievement, let's put it this way, of the Jesuits in their missions. Maybe because of the centrality of astronomy and mathematics in the China mission, the imperial mission. And I think things are quite different in other missionary fields, and the places occupied by astronomy in these different missionary fields are probably not the same as in China. And I'm not trying to imply that astronomy and mathematics and what we could call science has is of no importance in the different missions, but I think we should probably tone down the importance of all these things in the Jesuit missions, at least in the Portuguese Empire. Well, another remark. I have some case studies here. The main one relates to India, and that's why I'm in this session. But I'll probably devote more time to some theoretical worries about this question of the places of astronomy in the missionary fields than to a full development of my case studies. The other one is from Vietnam, and well, there are things also related to Portuguese America, but I'll really not even touch upon these things. Well, in his annual letter from 1603, relating what had happened in the Jesuit province of Malabar, the provincial Father Alberto Laercio includes an abstract of 3 letters he had got that year from one of the missionaries under his jurisdiction, who was for a long time operating between Cochin and Calicut. After telling about his own successes in the task of converting the heathens of the second city, Calicut, to the true Catholic faith, the author of the letter, an Italian named Giacomo Fenizio, mentions in one of them the particular interest of the local sovereign, the Samorin, for the terrestrial and celestial globes that he had shown him in an audience. And he describes as well a dispute he had with the court Brahmins on matters relating to astronomy and cosmology. 1 year before, in the annual letter of 1602, Laercio had included other 2 abstracts of correspondences the same Fenizio had sent him, both of them commenting in detail his involvement in disputes about the creation and structure of the universe with the so-called ignorant literati in the court and in open spaces. Fenizio says in one of those letters, abstracted in the annuals, I went to a huge pagoda in which several Brahmins live, and in the conversation I asked them if there was anyone who knew about heavenly sciences, about stars, planets, eclipses, about the philosophy of first principles, etc. They were embarrassed with those questions and told me they knew about all those sciences, but they were busy doing other things then and couldn't talk about this. In fact, according to Fernão Guerreiro, the Portuguese chronicler of the Jesuit missions in the first decade of the 17th century, we know that Fenizio, with great ease, in squares and public spaces of Calicut, where several times preaches, confounds them and ashames them with the nonsenses and filthy rites he reveals in their sect and in their pagodas, and in order that they see the ignorances of their gentility, the Father found in their books what they say about the creation of the world, which is that God made it out of an egg, and then he describes this. And finally, the Father started to question them which chicken laid this egg, and where did God take the rock where the world is hanging from. And well, there is a long quote here about how Father Fenizio embarrasses the Brahmins in Calicut. Well, the same Fernão Guerreiro, the same chronicler, he also tells us that this Father Fenicio also uses a technique to get to noble and literate people, which is treating about mathematics, particularly the sphere, because it's something that they like a lot to hear, and it's not very known to them. And when he discusses such things with them, he starts to talk about the divine things, and they pay attention, and in this way they get to know the truth, and they start to mock their own pagodas. Well, this is a very well-known pattern in several missionary fields of the Jesuits along all the 17th century. As mathematicians, astronomers, or cartographers, they repeatedly seem to wait to get the favor of powerful local elites, and in the limit to convert a sovereign together with all his domain or kingdom or empire. For example, there is a much more well-known Jesuit than Giacomo Fenicio, which is Antonio Rubino, who has been to southern India approximately in the same time, who tells us about his doing maps and globes and how this fascinated the king. And in fact, Rubino, since his arrival to the Portuguese state of India, to Goa, he was the heads of the missions wanted him because he seemed to be a very important asset in their task. He was a man related to people, to influential Jesuits, people like Christoph Grimberger, a disciple of Christoph Clavius, the important astronomer and mathematician of the Collegio Romano. And maybe we should just remember the very extensive literature about the role of mathematics, including astronomy and timekeeping, cartography, etc., in the China mission, to have a dimension of the importance that the actors themselves, but also generations of historians, attributed to scientific knowledge, let me put it this way, as a fundamental part of the missionary action of the Society of Jesus, with the elites it hoped to convert in Asia in the 17th century. From Matteo Ricci to the mathematicians of the king, and well into the 18th century, in fact, it was an important criterion in the selection of Jesuits to be sent to Asia, some kind of proficiency in disciplines like this, mathematics and astronomy and timekeeping and map making, etc. Well, but, and this is not an exclusivity of the China mission. In fact, in India, for example, people like Rubino were being sought for by the provincials and procurators and everybody. And Jesuits from several places in Asia were, in fact, asking colleagues in Europe to send them telescopes and mathematical and astronomical tables and things like this, not only those based in the Chinese court. Well, but a lot of the literature about science in the Jesuit missions in the East has tried to see the members of the Society of Jesus vectors in a process, in a unidirectional process of diffusion of knowledge produced in Europe in their missionary feuds in Asia, and also in America, at least in South America. So they would have taken with them European science to places which lacked traditions of investigation and explanation of nature, or which had wrong traditions. Well, this is one possibility of in the history of science of seeing the role of the Jesuit missionaries, but there is another possibility, which is to see them as not as supermen who knew everything about the latest European discoveries in astronomy, mathematics, etc., and were just giving them to ignorant people, but a complementary narrative which sees these missionaries as parts of this terrible colonial machine who were there using science in order to subjugate individuals and cultures, etc., etc. Well, I think both of these views are excessive. Both of them, they have, of course, their grains of truth, but they exaggerate in one direction or another. And maybe we have to rethink the places of scientific practices and scientific knowledge in the missionary fields, at least in the Jesuit missionary fields. So my point is not to substitute one narrative for another and take sides in this, but try to look and now in case studies for what science may have represented to the actors themselves. One example I just want to comment is of the also Italian Father Cristoforo Borri, who was a missionary in what is now Vietnam. He was there for almost 1 decade, and well, he has a very interesting trajectory. I will not enter into any details about this. It suffices to say that Cristoforo Borri went back to Europe after almost 1 decade in Vietnam, and he has written a lot of things about his experiences, his missionary experiences, and we can have through these writings a glimpse into what astronomy represented to himself. And well, first of all, there is a very interesting document, a letter he sent to the general of the Jesuits, Vitelleschi, where he complained that when he was in Europe in his youth, he was not allowed to teach the cosmology of Tycho Brahe, but as soon as he arrived in Asia, he was asked by his superior to write a small treatise about this cosmology, and this because his superior thought that local sovereigns would be much more interested in this kind of explanation of the universe than in what, up to that time, it was around 1612, 1613, was being taught by the Jesuits, which was still the Ptolemaic system. He just expresses his disappointment with this situation, but okay, I have to do this because this is part of my job here, and I think it's a nice illustration of the idea of orthopraxy. I mean, orthodoxy is subordinate to something which is the needs of the missionary field, the real field. So orthodoxy can be negotiated in a situation like this. Another example I have relating to this Jesuit, Cristoforo Borri, is his extensive observations of comets in Vietnam, especially the comet of 1618, which has been very important for him. He exchanged observations with other missionaries in different parts of Asia. This was instrumental in convincing him of the reality of the cosmological system of Tycho Brahe, and he simply did not use all of this in his missionary tasks. So what I'm implying here is that for Cristoforo Borri, astronomy could be, let's say, a personal pursuit, a personal interest. In some moments, it was to serve the needs of the mission. In other moments, it was his personal interest, which is registered in things he published much later in his life. Well, then I have this example of Giacomo Fenizio. I have talked a little bit about him. Now I have some more points to discuss about him. I'm also not going to tell you about his biography, which is quite interesting in the little we know about it. He has been to several places in southern India. But I want just to call your attention to some astronomical matters which are contained in the manuscript by this priest, Giacomo Fenizio. This manuscript is in fact attributed to him. It's not an autograph, but I think it's quite convincing. The arguments are quite convincing that he must be the author. It has remained in manuscript form since around 1610 until the 1930s, when it was edited, partially edited, and in some moments badly edited, because some words are simply wrong, like when he talks about the natural philosophers of India. He's in the first paragraph, and the editor transcribed this as the natural geologists of India and things like this. So, and all the astronomical chapters are not contained in this edition. And I think they are quite interesting because they show us, let's say, an average Jesuit of the early 17th century struggling with his own astronomy, something he had learned in his college years, and trying to use this astronomy to his missionary ends. Well, it's the first book of this treatise, which has 7 or 8 books. It has 8 books. The first one is dedicated to what I see as a philosophical discussion with the ignorant, the local ignorants, as he calls them, on astronomical and cosmological matters. Well, as I told you, in the first line, he tells us that the Brahmins in India are the philosophers and theologians, and not geologists. They invented for everybody a sect which is so out of reason that it's despicable, and well, there is all that usual dismissal of his object. But when he starts to discuss cosmological matters, I think he not simply dismissed them as diabolical inventions or things like this, but he is in pains to answer astronomical and cosmological arguments with what I sustain he sees as their equivalents in his own terms. So he describes us things like, for example, the idea he found there of the Earth not being round, the Earth being flat. Well, then he presents us this idea of the Earth being flat, and he starts to answer it in a very scholastic and very well-known way. He just doesn't say this is nonsense, this is diabolical nonsense. No, he goes like, from the same false axiom, they infer that the Earth is not round but flat. And this flatness is what the eyes can see. And then they have a firm certainty that the Earth is supported by a horn of a bull and he makes all this description. And then he starts to answer something like this, for example. Well, the truth is, according to the science of astronomy and physics, that the Earth is in the center of the world, surrounded by the skies, and it's round, etc., etc. And were it flat and supported by the horn of a bull, every time this bull moved itself, we would feel an earthquake, but we don't feel earthquakes all the time, so because the bull would be moving all the time, so this must be wrong. Then he goes to, for example, the idea of the several seas, which he identifies in his interlocutors. And, okay, thank you. And he presents us with arguments against the idea of a multiplicity of seas, and they are arguments based on what I would say is his astronomy, his physics, his philosophy, and it's not a plain dismissal of the arguments he's struggling against. And in a way, it seems to me that, well, he's there in the mission, he knows a little science from his college years, he has to find mediations with people he's trying to convert, and science can be one of those mediations. So in what maybe could call this, this huge task of cultural translation, science is one of the instruments which are employed and mobilized by Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century. And it's probably very different on average from that centrally important tool astronomy and mathematics was in the China mission. In other places, it's just something that can be used along with several other mediators to establish this possibility of communication, this cultural translation. And in some moments, it may be just a personal pursuit which has almost nothing to do with the daily tasks of the mission. Well, I think I have given my message to you about what I see as a need to rethink a little bit the places of science in early modern Jesuit missions, moving beyond the important but probably anomalous example of the China mission. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll open it up for 5 minutes of questions. See, Jose Antonio.
Thank you. I found very interesting your paper. I would like to ask you two things about astronomy in India in particular, or maybe Asia, because you spoke also about Borri. He was in Vietnam. You said that he used the Tychonic system, right? In fact, the Jesuit astronomers in China, they introduced in the 30s of the 17th century the Tycho Brahe system. So, do you know about the system, the cosmological system used in India, for example, by Fenicio? Of course, Fenicio is I saw that it's a little before, in 1610, 11. So he was more Tychonic or Ptolemaic. This is the first question. And the second, I don't know if you know, well, maybe no, but because the astronomy was not so central for the missionaries, the Jesuits in India, but of course, India also has a long tradition in astronomy. And I know that in several cities in India, there are old astronomical observatories until today, very big. So, did the Jesuits know about these astronomical observatories? And what did they think? They were, I don't know if they were aware about some astronomy, I mean Indian astronomy, before the arrival of the Europeans, or they didn't know, or they knew, but they thought that it was not important at all. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. As to the first one, Fenicio is a Ptolemaic, completely Ptolemaic, and I could venture to say he has the rudiments of spherical astronomy, not more than that. He left Europe before the publication of Tycho's proposal for a new system, and so when you read this document, you see he has memorized, for example, some parts of Ptolemy's star catalog. He has memorized a couple of very basic things about the sphere, and that's all. While on this question, what is interesting about Borri is that he was asked by a superior in the College of Macau, where he was stationed before going to Vietnam, to write a Tychonic treatise, and that much before the introduction of the system in the 1630s, as you said, and before the Society of Jesus around 1620 tacitly made it their, let's say, official system after Biancani's book. Well, as to Indian astronomy or several astronomical practices and corpora of knowledge. In the 18th century, there are Jesuits writing things we could call histories of astronomy in India. By the time of my character, I have no knowledge of a systematic assessment of things like this, and his own assessment is very far from systematic. It's based on very specific practices and let's say traditions that he was in contact with in his missionary work in a specific region of southern India. And even though I think he tries to answer that with the instruments he has, things he remembers, and this is what I find most interesting about him. He's not trying to write a huge treatise about astronomy. It's very far from his real interests. Astronomy is just something he grabs and uses in the very first pages of his much larger book, and then he will use, of course, religious arguments and, let's say, moral arguments and ethnographical and things, everything with inverted commas. It's kind of this.